Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and respected professional from San Francisco, USA, Dr. Clark Quinn. Clark, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here with you.
Dr. Quinn is an executive director of Quinnovation, which is a learning experience design strategy. He's an internationally known consultant, an author, and a keynote speaker, and he's an author of 7 books. So, Clark, my first question to you, tell me a little bit about your own journey and what got you interested in the field of learning and development.
A funny story.
Mhm.
I went to college to study marine biology.
Okay.
And I was looking at biology. I was taking the bio courses, and the problem was they were all cutthroat pre-med. People, would steal the answers off the door so nobody else could see what the answers to the quiz questions were. And it was rote memorization, and I could do it, but I found it boring. And so I waffled around a lot, and I was doing some tutoring for some extra cash, and I was doing some computer science because a friend of mine was having fun doing that. And I saw the connection between computers and learning, and I said, that's what I find interesting. And I designed my own major because we didn't have a major in that, but we had a mechanism to design your own major. And that back then we called it computer-based education. And that's been my career ever since. It's taken strange twists and turns. My first job out of college was designing and programming educational computer games.
Wow.
I realized we didn't know enough about how to do that, and how to do the design for the way our brains work. And I went back to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science. And that's been what I've done ever since, is looking at what we know about how we think, work, and learn, and applying that to the design of solutions, technology enabled, but not necessarily technology driven.
Incredible. You must be one of the very early people to have discovered gaming, which is such a hot industry today, isn't it?
Actually, I was led into it by my mentor and friend and colleague, Jim Schuyler. He had created a company to create games to go along with textbooks. And I pushed us into the home market. And yes, games have been a recurrent theme throughout my career since then. Looking at, and I was an academic after I did my PhD. I did a postdoc. I was academic for a few years, and doing research, I found an alignment between what makes experiences effectively educational and what makes them engaging. And if you understand the alignment, learning can and should be hard fun, not just trivial fun, but hard fun. And when you find that alignment, which is a problem because people get all excited about gamification, yet too often they mean trivial things like points and leaderboards and scores. And that's not what really is a component of what makes learning engaging and effective.
How interesting. And what do you believe are some of the most significant challenges facing learning and development professionals today?
There are several problems. What is a problem in L&D is a lack of measurement. We're not measuring the actual impact of our interventions. There are a lot of reasons for this. It's difficult. Nobody cares. And yet we therefore are doing too many things that people will say, oh, I liked it. And it has no long-term impact. We're throwing away a lot of money, frankly. And that to me is a challenge that we can only overcome when we start measuring, start trying to design for impact. And somebody recently said, you don't have to do that for every course you're designing, and that's okay with me. But we need to start trying to get it right. It expands to a much bigger picture about, how do we create cultures for learning, and what can be the impact of L&D going beyond just courses. But we first got to get courses right.
Correct. And what, in your view, are some common misconceptions about how people learn?
one of the biggest misconceptions is this notion that if you give people information, it will change their behavior.
Right.
We see this in too many informational, courses, and we see this in too much of K-12 higher ed. We give people information, test them on that information, and believe that that's going to lead to any change in behavior. And I think that was based upon a belief that we are formal, logical, reasoning beings. And that was the original, the cognitive revolution that happened in the 50s sort of went beyond the behavioral model that said we can't know what goes on in the brain, said we could, but the first models were formal, logical reasoning. And I think that stuck around, and yet we're not. And you look at behavioral economics or the work of people like Daniel Kahneman, that show that we have systematic flaws in our reasoning. And yet we continue to exhibit these behaviors that show, let's just change people's actions by giving them information. That doesn't happen in most instances. Really what you need is practice of actually doing meaningful things that you need people to be able to do with the information afterwards.
Great response. Thank you. My next question is, when I was reading about you and preparing for my conversation, I read this term metacognition. And I wanted to ask you, what is metacognition and what is the role of metacognition in learning? And can it be cultivated in learners?
So the last answer is yes, it can be cultivated. What is it and why should we? Metacognition is, the name implies, is thinking about thinking. And in our case, it's thinking about how we think and using that knowledge to do better. So we can create this loop that says, okay, we solved this problem. How did we solve this problem? Could we solve this problem better? And many models of, how we think and work say that there are our skills, and then there's this metacognitive supervision that invokes them at different times and places, and we can be smarter about it. There's a fair amount of evidence that things that that organizations ask for, they say, we want critical thinking and, we want creativity, but nobody teaches it. It's not taught really in K-12. It's not taught in higher ed. It's not taught in organizations. We just sort of expect it, and yet we can develop it. And there are results that show that when you intervene and try and get people to think better, they can, and that has a lasting effect. So helping people become aware of their own thinking and reflecting on it. And my colleague Harold Yarkey has this nice model I like called personal knowledge mastery, which it's seek knowledge. How do you seek knowledge? How do you both set up feeds of things that are interesting, and how do you then also search? What do you do with that knowledge? How do you make sense of it? And how do you share it with others? And being aware of the practices involved in each of those steps, to me, really is an opportunity to evaluate how you process information, to look for opportunities to do it more effectively, and improve your ability to be effective. I mean, I would suggest that the brand called you, the interviews you're having, are helping people see all these different practices and find opportunities to think and internalize for themselves the opportunity to get better at them.
Very interesting. Thank you. And how do cognitive biases affect learning? And how can we design learning experiences to mitigate these biases?
I'm torn towards the political biases we're seeing too much, and that's not what I think we want to talk about.
Absolutely.
Cognitive biases can be mistaken beliefs, like, oh, I'm a XYZ type of learner. I'm a visual learner or an auditory learner, and those sorts of beliefs can interfere with our ability to process information. For learning music, being a visual learner isn't necessarily going to help well. You need to be able to hear the music. If you're tone deaf like I am, that becomes a real struggle. But our learning should use the right method for the mechanism. And there are reasons to use different representations in different media. But they're not having to do with how we are as styles. It has to do with different representations that we can therefore process, but also becoming aware of the biases and helping people recognize and go along with them, and then maybe challenge them as they get more capable. are ways in which we can improve our own learning and the learning of others by ensuring that we are aware of cognitive biases. Our architecture, as powerful as it is, allowing you and I to talk across the world, basically,
Yeah.
we still have some architectural limitations. Our working memory is limited, and our recall tends to be about the general gist, not the specifics, and we have to work hard to overcome these. How do we design for that, make a combination of us and technology can be a chalkboard as well as, you know, your mobile phone,
Yeah.
the most effective? And how do we design for that, teach for that, and make people self-improving around that?
Fascinating. And my next question, Clark, is how do you see emerging technologies like AI impacting learning and development?
Do you want the real answer or the snarky answer?
Yes.
I worry that we get overexcited. We have this
Correct.
cargo cult mentality.
Correct.
There's some challenge to the Gartner hype cycle curve, but in some ways, I think it reflects that there's this. Somebody famously said, we overestimate the short-term impacts and underestimate the long-term impacts of technology. And right now people are excited about the term AI, and what they're really excited about is generative AI. And there's a lot of AI that's been around for decades. I've been an AI groupie for those decades. Symbolic first, and then when Dave Romahart and Jay McClellan came up with a sort of connectionist models that drive a lot of our machine learning now, that was a revolution. And yet that happened in the 80s when I was a grad student. I was in the lab, and yet now it's the 2020s, and suddenly we're seeing generative AI really explode. So I think a cautious skepticism is valuable. And back to that point I've made about us properly augmenting ourselves with technology, the more that the technology advances, the more amazing partnerships we can have. But I think there's a overexcited belief that we're near artificial general intelligence. We have these really smart things in very narrow areas, and that's been true and is still true. They do some amazing seeming things, but they're actually surprisingly narrow, and they're nowhere near general intelligence. So I think that with that, guarded skepticism, or optimistic skepticism, let me say, we can find ways to use it to improve ourselves and to augment us, but we have to be very careful. We want to choose what we want to take on ourselves and what we want the technology to do. I don't want to be doing laundry so the AI can be creating beautiful drawings and presentations. Just not how I want to live. And I think we should choose how we want to use it.
Correct. Well said. And how can L&D teams balance innovation with practicality in their training programs?
This again comes down to, I'm going to draw a blank on who that was, but Garvin Edmondson and Gino came up with a paper about what makes a learning organization that reflects the famous book about it. Senge talked about learning organization, but they broke it down into some elements that reflect his 5 things, but theirs was based on some really good research. And they talked about creating a learning culture, and I think that's what you need. And in fact, I argue L&D needs to get on top of these mechanisms themselves. And when I say these mechanisms, I mean things like, first of all, an environment and a culture that says we don't just tolerate diversity, we actually value it, and we want to take advantage of the diversity. We want to be open to new ideas. We want to have time for reflection, and we want to make it psychologically safe for people to contribute. And then, as part of it, is ongoing experimentation. And Amy Edmondson just came out with a new book about smart experimentation, about failing isn't bad, but just dumb failing is. Smart failing is part of the process of innovation. So I think organizations need this, and I think L&D needs to own it first, because you can't take it to the rest of the organization until you're demonstrating you're doing it yourself. And I think that's how they become innovation with practicality. They do the things they need to do, but smart experimentation is trying out different ways of doing things. getting your handle on technologies like VR and AR, not throwing it at everything, but
Mm.
trying small experiments and saying, okay, when does this make sense and where could we use it in a way that gives us good value? You try things out, you take the lessons learned, you gradually improve what you're doing. So you're meeting the practical needs you have, but you're continuing to innovate as well. And that's not just true for L&D, but it should start with L&D, and then when they're successful, they take it to the rest of the company.
Mm. Well said, sir. And how can organizations build a culture that supports continuous learning and development?
Building a culture is hard.
Correct.
And you have to have absolute commitment from the top. You have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And it's going to take time. People aren't going to believe it. If you say to your employees, you have to work out loud and share mistakes, but you don't do it yourself, are they truly going to believe it's safe? No. You really have to work on those behaviors. People like Mark Britz and others talk about the culture is actually manifests in the behaviors in the organization. And if the behaviors are critiquing other people because of who they are and not being open and hoarding information, you're not going to get there. So you've got to gradually move those behaviors. And I think it starts at the top. It's the policies you set, the behaviors you exhibit, and what you expect from the people below you. And it takes a concerted effort, but when you get there, the outcomes are better for the organization as a whole.
And, you just spoke about the commitment of leaders or leadership for culture. My follow-up question is, what role do you think leadership development plays in the broader learning and development landscape?
It's interesting. I heard in a session, he runs a monthly session, our colleague Will Thalheimer was talking about how leadership development typically doesn't include facilitating the learning of those underneath you as part of leadership development programs. And yet increasingly people are saying the role of leadership is moving from management and top-down dictation and setting things to coaching to people. And you look at self-determination theory, DC and Ryan stuff that my colleague Matt Richter talks about a lot. Self-determination theory says you need to give people the autonomy to pursue the goals. You need to give them support to be competent in pursuing those goals. And you want relatedness, other people helping and all caring about everybody succeeding. You need to build, that's part of that culture for the previous question, but also how leadership development needs to understand that and show the importance and give people skills in facilitating the learning of others. And that's what I think should be in leadership development. And there's, at least my colleagues claims who's looked at this, says that it's not as systemically part of leadership development as it could and should be.
What a great response. Thank you. And Clark, what role does storytelling play in designing an effective learning experience?
Our brains are wired to understand story. Geary talks about the difference between biologically primary and biologically secondary things we learn, and storytelling is very biologically primary.
Right.
And again, it seems our brains are wired to comprehend it. And so it's a very effective way to communicate messages, and wrapping things in stories is important for communication in general and learning in particular. We do have evidence that learning abstract, arbitrary problems doesn't lead to transferability of those skills to problems in the real world, which makes me wonder why in K-12 education we give kids a bunch of abstract, arbitrary problems. Doesn't help, but solving problems in context and making sure we choose the context, and those contexts are really little stories. They're really little situations. We should make sure that they're interesting stories, both in the examples we present and in the practice problems we have, so that people are going, I'm solving a meaningful problem, and when I succeed, I've made a little story about how I win. And we can write an overarching story. That's not always worth it, but there are times when it is. And story is just a shorthand way to get a message through in ways that we can resonate with. we
Correct.
shouldn't assume people will pick up the meaning of this story. Some people can read the same novel and take totally, completely different stories out of it. So there may need to be facilitation of why that story is important, but it still makes it more comprehensible, makes it more meaningful, and therefore increases the likelihood that it's going to have a long-term impact.
Amazing. So I have time for two more questions for you. What are some of the areas of learning and development that you believe need more attention or innovation?
Measurement again,
Measurement,
as I
absolutely.
suggested already.
Mhm.
And I don't think we pay enough attention. The measurement would point out things we're doing wrong. We do a couple things wrong. We tend to emphasize content over practice because it's easier to dump a bunch of content on it than to design meaningful practice. And yet practice is what really develops skills. And we don't differentiate the content. We don't focus too much. It's sort of, we give content instead of saying, this is the model, these are the examples. Then they get practice to apply those models to their own situations. And the examples give them guidance about how the model gets applied in context. Understanding that learning science, I think, is something we don't do enough because we don't measure, so we don't care. We have this sort of belief that if we build it, it is good. We follow the design process, so therefore it must be accurate, and it's not. And then we haven't paid enough attention to the engagement side of the story. When we're emotionally engaged, we learn better. And yet we don't tell people up front why they should care.
Correct.
We don't make the examples and the practices meaningful. We can, we should, we don't talk enough about it. Part of the reason I wrote my most recent book, Make It Meaningful, was just to help unpack those elements that come in many ways and times from games, but can be applied to learning more broadly. And that's really, I think, an opportunity for us to lift our game.
Very well said. And my last question to you, how do you think the role of learning and development will evolve in the next few years?
Somebody once said, don't predict anything, particularly the future. So I tend to talk about what I would like to see. I would like to see us recognize, and I think it's happening. There's evidence, there's been a growth over the past couple decades of the number of books talking about learning science. I think people are beginning to recognize it's important, beginning to start thinking about it. They're beginning to fight with their vendors for it. And unfortunately, they have to a wee bit. But I think L&D has the opportunity. I'm going to make a brief editorial statement here. Organizations increasingly are facing more challenges more frequently. And the ability to execute on the things you know you need to do is only going to be the cost of entry going forward. And I suggest that the only sustainable differentiator that'll keep your organization from just surviving to actually thriving is going to be continual innovation. And that's an opportunity for L&D. I think it's when you're doing research, you're doing design, you're doing troubleshooting, you don't know the answer when you start. So by definition, that's learning. And therefore, there's a case that L&D should be responsible for facilitating those activities. And if they're facilitating not just the formal learning to do the things you know you need to do, but the ongoing learning that opens up new opportunities for the organization, new ways to do things, new markets, new products, that's going to move L&D to a central position of opportunity to assist the organization in learning. And that, I think, is an exciting opportunity and a strategic one. And that's the direction I would love to see L&D take on board, take ownership of, again, get it working internally first, and then take it out to the organization and help the organizations learn faster, better, and more successfully.
Well said. And on that note, Clark, thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey into how you discovered learning and development. Thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of L&D. I think we covered a lot of ground. I learned many things from you today in this area of learning and development. We covered areas about cognitive biases. We talked of misconceptions. We talked about leveraging technology. We, of course, learned today from you how you would like learning and development to be more specific and measurable. And I think that is such an important factor, which you emphasize several times. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you. And thank you all for paying attention.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.